The fiddle had not made a sound in 3 years, and every soul in Redemption Creek, Texas knew better than to ask Ira Hudson why. It sat in the corner of his modest ranch house like a ghost, propped against the rough-hewn wall near the stone fireplace, its varnished spruce top dulled by a thin layer of dust that no one ever wiped away because doing so would have felt like a kind of desecration. Ira had built the small shelf bracket that held it himself, back when his hands still remembered joy, back when a little boy named Thomas used to sit cross-legged on the braided rug and clap his chubby palms together every time his father drew the bow across the strings. The fiddle had been a gift from Ira's own father, carved and shaped in a workshop in Tennessee, brought west across the Cumberland Gap and through the long prairie winds to find its voice in this corner of the Texas Hill Country in the year 1882. And in 1882 it had gone silent. The same autumn the fever swept through the valley and took Thomas with it. Ira was 34 years old then, broad-shouldered and sun-weathered, with dark eyes that people used to say were full of music. After the fever, those eyes went quiet too. By the spring of 1885, Ira Hudson was 37, running a cattle operation on 400 acres of cedar-spotted land along the Pedernales River, employing 2 ranch hands named Cobb and Jesse, and doing his level best to speak only when spoken to. He was not unkind. He paid fair wages. He kept his fences mended and his cattle healthy and his debts settled. The women of Redemption Creek had tried over the years to bring him casseroles and pies and the occasional flutter of eyelashes, and he had thanked them politely and sent them home with their dishes washed. He had been married once to a woman named Clara, who had left the valley 2 years after Thomas died because the grief in that house was too large a thing to live alongside. Ira had not blamed her for going. He had simply watched her wagon roll down the road until the dust swallowed it, and then he had gone back to work. It was the first Tuesday of April when the stagecoach from San Antonio arrived in Redemption Creek carrying, among its passengers, a woman who would change everything. Evelyn Whitaker was 28 years old, and she stepped down from that dusty Concord coach with a canvas traveling bag in one hand, a small leather satchel in the other, and the particular expression of a person who has decided that fear is a luxury she cannot afford. She was of medium height, with dark auburn hair coiled at the nape of her neck and brown eyes that were sharp and warm at the same time, the way firelight is warm but also honest about the darkness around it. She wore a practical gray dress that had seen better days, and the heels of her boots were worn down at an angle that told a story about long walks and harder circumstances. She had come from San Antonio because there was nothing left for her there. Her father had died in January, leaving behind a boarding house with more debts than rooms, and the bank had taken the property before February was out. Evelyn had spent 2 months doing laundry and mending for other households, saving what she could, and when she heard that a woman named Mrs. Aldridge in Redemption Creek needed a bookkeeper for the general store, she had written a careful letter, received a careful reply, and spent the last of her savings on a stagecoach ticket and the future. Mrs. Aldridge was a stout woman of 60 with iron-gray hair and the disposition of someone who had always meant exactly what she said. She was waiting at the station when the coach arrived, holding a sign with Evelyn's name written on it in large block letters, which Evelyn found both efficient and touching. "You are smaller than I expected," Mrs. Aldridge said by way of greeting, looking her over with frank appraisal. "I am competent in spite of it," Evelyn replied without missing a beat. Mrs. Aldridge smiled, and that was that. The room Evelyn rented was at the back of the general store, a narrow space with a window that looked out onto the alley, a rope bed with a straw mattress, and a small table where she could keep her ledger books. It was not comfortable in the way her childhood bedroom had been comfortable, but it was hers, and she scrubbed it clean that first afternoon until it smelled like lye soap and possibility. She set her father's old pocket watch on the windowsill and looked at the flat Texas sky going orange at the edges, and she told herself, very quietly, that this was the beginning. Redemption Creek was a town of perhaps 250 people, strung along a wide main street with a church at one end, a saloon at the other, and between them the necessities of frontier life: a livery, a smithy, a barbershop that also served as a dentist's office, the general store, a small hotel, and the post office. The courthouse was a two-room building with a flagpole out front that flew its flag with aggressive patriotism regardless of weather. There was also a schoolhouse at the edge of town, and on Sunday mornings the church bell rolled out across the cedar-covered hills, and everyone who was not hiding from God or a hangover made their way to services. Evelyn settled into the rhythm of the store within her first week. She had a gift for numbers, had learned it from her father who kept meticulous accounts even when the accounts were terrible, and she brought that same meticulous care to Mrs. Aldridge's books, which were a cheerful disaster of penciled notes on loose papers and sums that did not add up because someone had been doing the arithmetic in their head and doing it wrong. She sorted and reconciled and organized with the focused pleasure of a person doing work they were genuinely suited for, and within a fortnight Mrs. Aldridge was declaring to anyone who would listen that Evelyn Whitaker was the best thing to happen to the store since they had gotten in the new coffee grinder. It was in her third week in Redemption Creek that Evelyn first saw Ira Hudson. He came in on a Wednesday morning for provisions: flour, salt, dried beans, a new coil of rope. He was a tall man, lean but not thin, with the kind of build that came from actual physical labor rather than any deliberate effort at it. He wore a battered hat the color of old tobacco, and his dark hair was shot through at the temples with gray that had come too early, the way grief sometimes ages a person ahead of schedule. He nodded at Mrs. Aldridge, set his list on the counter, and waited without fidgeting while she gathered his items. He did not look around the store with curiosity or impatience. He simply stood there with a kind of settled stillness, like a tree. Evelyn was at the small desk behind the counter, recording the previous day's transactions, and she noticed him the way you notice something that does not quite fit the category you have placed it in. He was not unfriendly, exactly. He was simply elsewhere. His body was in the store, but the rest of him was off somewhere beyond reach, and she found herself wondering, with the part of her mind that always wanted to understand things, what had put him there. "Mr. Hudson," Mrs. Aldridge said, totaling his account. "This is Miss Whitaker. She's been helping me with the books." He turned and looked at Evelyn directly, and she saw that his eyes were very dark and that there was something in them she recognized without being able to name it right away. She would name it later, lying in her narrow bed listening to the night wind off the hills. It was the look of someone who has learned that the worst thing they feared could actually happen, and it did, and now they are living in the aftermath. "Miss Whitaker," he said, with a single nod. "Mr. Hudson," she replied. "He paid for his goods, loaded them onto his wagon, and drove out of town. That was all." She asked Mrs. Aldridge about him that evening, the way you ask about something you've been thinking about more than you intended to. Mrs. Aldridge set down her teacup and looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of someone deciding how much truth to tell. Then she told it all, because she was that kind of woman. About Thomas, the little boy, 4 years old when the scarlet fever took him. About Clara, who had gone to live with her sister in Austin. About the fiddle that sat in the corner of his house, that no one had heard played in 3 years. About how Ira Hudson had been the best fiddler in 3 counties before that, how he used to play at barn dances and socials and the town's 4th of July celebration, how people used to travel miles just to hear him, how the music had lived in him like a second heartbeat. "He doesn't play anymore," Mrs. Aldridge said simply. "Not since." Evelyn sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the evening insects had started their chorus. "That's a terrible waste," she said softly, meaning both the music and the man. "It is," Mrs. Aldridge agreed. "But grief is not a thing you can rush." Evelyn nodded, but she kept thinking about it. She had grown up with music in her household. Her father had played the harmonica, badly and joyfully, and she had grown up understanding that music was not merely entertainment, but a form of speaking that words could not always manage. To lose music was to lose a language. She understood that. But she also understood, having lost her own father, that the silence you chose to live in could become its own kind of prison if you let it. She did not go looking for a reason to speak with Ira Hudson. But Redemption Creek was not a large town, and the paths of its residents crossed with the regularity that small places imposed. She saw him at the church the following Sunday, sitting in the third pew from the back, alone. She saw him at the livery when she went to inquire about renting a horse for the Saturday she had off. She saw him at the post office on a Thursday, and because they arrived at the door at the same moment, he held it open for her, and she thanked him, and he said, "You're welcome," and she noticed that he smelled of horses and cedar and honest work, and she found that she did not mind it at all. The fourth time they spoke with any substance was not by coincidence. It was a Saturday afternoon in late April, and Evelyn had borrowed Mrs. Aldridge's roan mare and ridden out to see the hills because she had been working in a small room for 3 weeks, and her soul needed sky. She had followed one of the lesser roads out of town and ended up, without entirely meaning to, in the vicinity of the Hudson Ranch, where she pulled the mare to a stop at a low creek crossing, because there was something quietly beautiful about the way the afternoon light fell through the cypress trees and hit the running water. She was sitting there on horseback, simply looking, when she heard a sharp cracking sound from the direction of the ranch yard, and then a loud, frustrated oath. She hesitated for only a moment before she rode toward the sound, because it did not sound dangerous so much as urgent. Ira Hudson was standing in his yard beside a fence post that had snapped at the base, with the weight of a section of cedar rail fence now leaning on him, and apparently no one else around to help hold it. His 2 hands were occupied with keeping it from falling entirely, and he was in the particular physical predicament of being unable to do anything useful until someone relieved him of the weight. Evelyn got down from her horse without deliberation, tied the reins to a nearby mesquite branch, walked over and put her shoulder under the opposite end of the rail. "Tell me what you need," she said. He looked at her over the length of cedar with an expression that mixed surprise and relief and something close to embarrassment. "There's another post in the shed," he said, nodding toward a small structure 20 feet away. "Short one already cut, and the sledgehammer." She went and found them, brought them back, and held the rail steady while he drove the replacement post, working with efficient, forceful strokes. When it was done, he set the sledgehammer down and straightened, and they both looked at the repaired section for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "That was not how I planned this afternoon." "Plans rarely survive contact with cedar posts," she said. He looked at her with something that might have been the ghost of a smile and then looked away again. "You're the woman from the store, Miss Whitaker." "I am. I was riding by and heard the excitement. I sent Cobb and Jessie into town for the afternoon," he said, as though explaining why he had been alone and at the mercy of a fence. "Didn't plan on the post giving way. These things tend to know when you've sent your help away." He was quiet for a moment. A barn swallow cut a low arc over the yard. "Would you like some water?" he said. "Or coffee? I have coffee on." It was a simple offer, and she knew it was simple, but it was also the first time, she suspected, that Ira Hudson had invited anyone into his house in quite some time. "Coffee would be very welcome," she said. His house was clean in the way a solitary man's house is clean when he is fundamentally orderly but has no one to keep things warm. There was a cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of supplies, a braided rug on the plank floor. And in the corner on the small bracket shelf he had built himself, the fiddle. She did not look at it obviously, but she saw it. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and they sat at the table, and for a while neither of them said anything because both of them were people who understood that silence did not always require filling. Outside, the cedar hills went gold in the declining afternoon light. The creek spoke softly to itself in the distance. "You're not from here," he said. It was not a question. "San Antonio," she said. "My father ran a boarding house. He died in January and the bank took the property. Mrs. Aldridge needed a bookkeeper. He received this without excessive sympathy or comment, which she appreciated. He simply nodded and said, "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you," she said. "He was a good man." He would have liked it out here. He liked places that made you feel small in a way that was honest about it. Ira looked out the window at the Cedar Hills. "That is a good way to put it," he said. They talked for perhaps 40 minutes, which was, she would learn later, more than Ira Hudson had talked to anyone in months. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle, about the particular challenges of running a spread without enough water in dry years. She told him about the books at the store, about the satisfaction of making numbers tell the truth. It was not romantic conversation. It was simple and steady and honest, and it had the quality of a fire that has been laid properly. It did not blaze, but it held its warmth. When she rose to go, she looked at the fiddle because she could not help it, and he saw her look. He said nothing about it, and she respected that silence. She thanked him for the coffee, and he walked her to where her horse was tied and helped her mount up, which was a courtesy she didn't strictly need, but accepted without comment, because there was something in the gesture that felt like the first unfurling of something long closed. She rode back to town thinking about his hands. The way they had gripped the sledgehammer. The way they had wrapped around the tin coffee cup. Hands that had once made music. She made herself stop thinking about it. May came in green and warm, and Redemption Creek shook off its winter quiet and became busy with the business of spring. Ranchers brought their accounts to the store to square before the cattle drives up to the railhead at San Antonio. The schoolchildren ran out of their building at noon recess with that particular charged energy of children who have been cooped up too long. Mrs. Aldridge decided to repaint the front of the store and hired 2 young men who spent more time discussing the correct shade of blue than actually painting, which resulted in a front wall that was 2 slightly different blues divided at a seam nobody could explain. Ira came to the store each Wednesday, regular as the calendar. He always nodded to Evelyn. She always nodded back. Occasionally they exchanged a few words about practical matters, whether she had found the hills to her liking, whether the summer was looking to be dry. The conversations were short and cordial and contained, and she told herself they were enough. But she noticed things. She noticed that he always bought enough provisions for one, never extra. She noticed that the line between his brows that looked like permanent concern softened slightly when he was listening to her talk. She noticed that he paused sometimes before he left the store, as though he was considering saying something else, and then did not, and then walked out. The first time she asked him about Thomas was not intentional. It was an accident of honest speech. It was a Wednesday in the middle of May, and she was showing him the new account book she had set up for his ranch, because he had mentioned in passing that his own records were a muddle, and she had offered without quite meaning to. He was leaning over the counter looking at the column she had drawn, and she said something about a section she had labeled for miscellaneous, and she said it reminded her of the way her father had kept a category in his accounts called "The World's Inconveniences." And she laughed describing it, and Ira smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him genuinely smile, and it changed his face entirely. "My son used to call the miscellaneous drawer in the kitchen the mystery drawer," Ira said, and then stopped, as though the sentence had escaped before he could catch it. The air between them went careful. "Thomas," she said very quietly. He looked at her. "Mrs. Aldridge told you," he said. She mentioned him, yes. He was quiet for a long moment. The store was empty except for the 2 of them and the afternoon fly that buzzed against the window glass. "He was 4, Ira said. "He was the brightest thing I ever knew." She did not offer condolences or sorry phrases. She simply looked at him and said, "He sounds like he was." Ira nodded once, short and sharp, and then he put his hat back on and thanked her for the account book and left. But the next Wednesday when he came in, he looked at her directly when he said hello, and there was something different in it. A slight opening. as though having spoken the name out loud to someone who received it carefully had unclosed a small door somewhere. She had begun to see him in other contexts too, as the town's social life thickened with the warmth of spring. There was a church social in mid-May, with potluck supper on long tables outside, and she went because Mrs. Aldridge insisted, and also because she liked the community of it. Ira was there, standing at the periphery of the gathering with a plate of food he was working through with the focused attention of a man who is using eating as an excuse not to have to circulate. She brought her own plate over and stood beside him, and they watched the children chase each other through the churchyard, and she said nothing for a while, and then he said, "That boy in the red shirt reminds me of Thomas," and he said it calmly as though it was a thing he could say now. "In what way?" she asked. "The way he runs," Ira said, "like he's sure the ground will hold him." She thought about that for a long time afterward. It was early June when she saw the Fiddle again, this time under different circumstances. She had ridden out to the ranch to return his account book with the May figures recorded, a task she had offered to do because she was expanding the service to several ranch operations around the valley, and his was one of them. She arrived at midday to find the yard quiet, the ranch hands out on the range, and Ira sitting on the porch steps. He had the fiddle in his hands, not playing it, just holding it. He was turned slightly so he did not see her come around the corner of the fence, and she pulled her horse to a stop and watched for a moment, because something in the tableau stopped her. He was holding it across his knees with both hands, the way you hold something you love that has become painful to touch. His head was bent over it slightly, and he was utterly still, and she could not see his face, but she could see his hands, and they were gripping the instrument with a force that was not violence but was not gentleness either. It was the grip of a man trying to decide something. She made enough noise with the horse that he heard her and looked up, and he set the fiddle down on the step beside him with deliberate ease, as though he had simply been resting it there. She did not mention it when she dismounted and came to the porch. She handed him the account book and they talked about the beef prices for a while. And then she sat on the step and he sat on the step, and the fiddle was there between them, and neither of them looked at it until she said, quietly, "Would you play something?" The silence that followed was large. He looked at her. His expression was the strangest thing she had ever seen on a person's face, a simultaneous war between refusal and longing so acute it was almost physical to witness. "I haven't played since Thomas died," he said. "I know," she said. "I don't think I can." She looked at him steadily, not with pity, not with the particular soft expression people used when they were about to push you toward something, just with calm, level attention, the way you look at someone when you are truly seeing them. "I think it might help," she said, "but I also think that is entirely your choice to make, and I will not say anything more about it." He looked at the fiddle. He looked at the hills. He looked at his own hands. She waited, and she did not fill the silence. He picked up the fiddle slowly, and she watched his hands settle around it with a familiarity so deep it was almost involuntary, the way your hands remember things your mind has tried to put away. He tucked it under his chin. He lifted the bow. And then he sat there for a moment with the bow hovering over the strings, and his whole body was shaking slightly, just slightly, barely visible, and she saw it and said nothing. He drew the bow. The first note came out rough and broken, the way a voice sounds when you have not spoken in too long, and he stopped immediately. He sat with his eyes closed and his jaw set. She did not say anything. She looked at the cedar hills and gave him the privacy of not being watched. He drew the bow again. This time the note held, ragged at the edges, uncertain, but it held. And then another note, and then he was playing, if you could call it that, because it was not playing the way it had once been playing. It was something rawer than playing. It was a man making a sound that had no name she could put to it, something between grief and prayer and protest, and the kind of crying that happens when you have been silent so long the silence itself cracks under its own weight. She let the tears run down her face without wiping them, because that seemed like the only honest thing to do. He played for perhaps 4 minutes, fragmented and stumbling, stopping and starting, the melody broken and reassembled and broken again. And then he stopped and lowered the fiddle and sat with his head bowed and his hands in his lap. After a long while he said, very quietly, "I did not expect that." "Nor did I," she said, and her voice was rough too. He looked at her then and saw the tears, and something moved across his face that was complicated and enormous, too large for an expression to fully contain. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." "You played beautifully," she said, because it was true in the way that matters, the beauty that exists not in perfect execution but in the fact of the courage it took. "I played terribly," he said. "Not the notes," she said. "The rest of it." He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment something between them that had been waiting with immense patience for the right conditions finally, quietly, took hold. Not yet love, not yet anything so named, but the ground of it, the soil turned over and the first warmth reaching down. "Would you stay for supper?" he asked. She looked at him and considered and said yes. Supper was beans and salt pork and cornbread. Nothing elaborate, but they sat at his table and talked for 2 hours, and she told him about her childhood in San Antonio, about her mother who had died when she was 12 and left her and her father to make do together, about the way her father used to play the harmonica on Sunday afternoons, and how she had never been able to teach him to play in tune, and how that had never mattered at all. And he told her about growing up in Tennessee, about his own father who had taught him to play the fiddle, about coming west at 22 with the particular American certainty that land and work could make a life. He told her more about Thomas. Small things, the mystery drawer, the way the boy had been afraid of thunder but fascinated by lightning, which seemed philosophically inconsistent for a 4-year-old and had made Ira laugh. The way he had tried to teach Thomas the simplest fiddle melody and Thomas had held the bow with both hands and sawed at the strings with the total absence of self-consciousness that children have before they learn to be embarrassed. Evelyn listened to all of it. She laughed at the right moments. She was quiet at the right moments. She was not performing either response. She was simply present, in the way that some people are present and others never quite manage to be. When she rode back to town in the late evening, the stars out in their full Texas abundance over the dark hills, she was aware of something warm in her chest that she recognized and did not fully trust yet. She was 28 and practical, and she had learned that the things you wanted were not always the things you were going to get, and she had made her peace with that. But she also knew that tonight something had happened that was larger than fence repairs and coffee and account books, and she was not sure what to do with it. She decided to do nothing except be herself and wait. Ira Hudson, riding back from checking on his South pasture cattle that night under the same enormous sky, was having a closely related conversation with himself. He had not felt this complicated in 3 years. He had become accustomed to being simple, to the clean mathematics of work and seasons and solitude, and something about Evelyn Whitaker had introduced variables he did not know how to calculate. The way she had sat with him when he played. The way she had looked at the hills instead of at him when he needed not to be looked at. The way she laughed, not with performance but with actual delight, as though she had come out the other side of sadness and found that laughter was still there waiting for her. He thought about Thomas. He thought about the melody he had started to play, stumbling and broken. He thought about how the fiddle had felt in his hands after 3 years of silence, like lifting something you had dropped a long time ago and finding it still recognized you. He thought about Evelyn's face when she turned to say goodbye, with the evening light on her cheekbones and her eyes warm and direct. He unsaddled his horse in the dark and went to bed and lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling, and the feeling was not exactly happiness yet, but it was the architecture of a place where happiness might be built. June continued green and warm. The creek ran full from late spring rains, and the cattle were fat, and the store was busy with summer trade. Evelyn expanded her bookkeeping service to 3 other ranches in the valley, which gave her both additional income and reasons to ride out into the countryside, which she had discovered she loved with a passion that surprised her. She had been a city girl, born to cobblestones and boardwalks, and the open land of the hill country had taken hold of her in a way she had not anticipated. Ira came to the store on Wednesdays and sometimes appeared at her desk in the back with a question about his accounts that probably did not require a personal visit, but that she was glad for all the same. They had supper together twice more at his ranch, and once at the Redemption Creek Hotel dining room, which was not a formal occasion except that Evelyn wore her better dress and Ira wore a clean shirt with his hat in his hand, and they both pretended it was just practical convenience. The town noticed, of course. Redemption Creek was not large enough for things to happen without being noticed. Mrs. Aldridge said nothing because she was not the sort to meddle once she had decided the thing was good, but she watched with the satisfied expression of someone who knows they set a correct process in motion simply by hiring the right person. The barber noticed. The minister's wife noticed, and said something meaningfully vague at the women's church circle that everyone present understood perfectly. Ira played the fiddle again in mid-June, this time by intention rather than impulse. He told Evelyn he had been practicing in the evenings alone, and his voice was careful when he said it, as though he was reporting a recovery from illness and was not yet sure the recovery would hold. She asked him how it felt, and he thought about it seriously before answering. "Like learning to walk again after a long time in bed," he said. "The muscles remember, but the confidence doesn't, not yet." "That sounds about right," she said. "I played Thomas's melody last night," he said. The simple one I had been teaching him. He said this with his eyes looking out the window, and his voice was steady but barely. "How was that?" she asked. "Terrible," he said, and then not terrible. He paused. "I think I am going to keep playing." "Good," she said. The word was simple, but it carried everything she wanted to put into it, and he heard all of it. It was the first week of July when Ira Hudson held Evelyn Whitaker's hand for the first time, and it happened in the least romantic setting possible. Outside the Redemption Creek post office at 8 in the morning, having collided coming around opposite corners of the building, sending her letters onto the boardwalk and her off balance, and he caught her elbow with one hand and then held her hand with the other to steady her, and neither of them moved for a moment after she was clearly no longer in any danger of falling. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. He did not let go of her hand immediately. She did not pull it away. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, which was a considerable achievement because her heart was doing something unreasonable. He released her hand and helped gather her letters from the boardwalk, and they stood there with the July morning warm around them and the sound of the town going about its business. And Ira Hudson looked at Evelyn Whitaker with the full dark attention of his eyes and said, "Miss Whitaker, I wonder if you might permit me to call on you formally." In the way that he stopped and tried again. "I mean to say that I have come to value your company considerably, and I would like to spend more time in it if that is agreeable to you." It was the most words she had heard him string together at one time, and she could see that it had cost him something to say them, and that made her fonder of him than almost anything else could have. "I think that would be very agreeable," she said. The 4th of July celebration in Redemption Creek was the town's biggest event of the year, and for 1885 the organizing committee had put together a full day's program. A morning parade, afternoon games and competitions, a potluck supper, and in the evening a dance in the town hall with music provided by whoever could be persuaded to play. For the past 3 years, the dance had been a lesser affair than it used to be, because the best musician in the valley had stopped playing, and no one had found a substitute that people felt as strongly about. When word got around that Ira Hudson might play the 4th of July dance, the information traveled through Redemption Creek with the velocity of rumor and the permanence of fact. Nobody knew exactly how the word got out. It may have been that Evelyn mentioned it to Mrs. Aldridge, or it may have been that Jesse, one of Ira's ranch hands, overheard something and could not contain himself. By the 1st of July, half the town was treating it as settled. Ira, when he found out people were expecting it, went quiet in the way he went quiet when he was working something through, and Evelyn found him one evening on his porch with the fiddle across his knees again, not playing, thinking. "You don't have to," she said, sitting down beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I know," he said, but she said he looked out at the hills going violet in the evening. "Thomas loved the 4th of July," he said. "We only had 2 of them with him, but he was wild for it. The noise and the running and the flags." A pause. "I think he would have wanted the dancing." She waited. "I think it is time," he said. She reached over and put her hand over his, over the hand that rested on the fiddle, and his hand turned under hers and held it. And they sat like that as the sky went from violet to deep blue, and the first stars came out over the cedar hills. The 4th of July arrived with the absolute commitment of a Texas summer day, blazing blue sky, the air still and thick by mid-morning. The parade went down Main Street at 10 o'clock with the schoolchildren carrying a homemade flag and the mayor riding a white horse that was not entirely comfortable with crowds. There were horse races in the afternoon on the flat ground east of town, and a shooting competition that drew 15 entrants, and was won by a sunburned woman named Hattie Crane from the Crane Ranch, who hit the target every time and accepted her ribbon with characteristic brevity. There was 3-legged racing and a pie-eating contest and a tug-of-war between the mercantile team and the ranch hands team that ended in a disputed draw. Evelyn was everywhere through it all, laughing and talking and meeting people she had not yet met in her 3 months in the valley, and she noticed how much more at ease she was now than she had been in April when everything was new, and she was still holding herself carefully. Redemption Creek had become her place in a way she had not planned for but was deeply grateful for. Ira was there through the afternoon, quieter than most but present in a way that felt different from his usual periphery standing. He stood with Cobb and Jesse at the races and hollered when their horse came through, which surprised both of them enough that they exchanged a look over his head. He ate supper at the long tables and sat beside Evelyn and reached across twice to refill her lemonade without being asked. When the tables were cleared and the chairs pushed back along the walls and the lanterns lit, and the town hall filled with the expectant milling of people who have been dancing in their heads all day and are ready to do it with their feet, Ira Hudson walked to the front of the room with the fiddle under his arm and the bow in his hand, and the noise of the room dropped the way rooms drop when something they have been waiting for arrives. He stood there for a moment under the lamplight with the fiddle at his side, and he looked out at the room. Evelyn was standing against the far wall, and their eyes met across the people and the space and the lamplight, and she gave him the smallest nod, just the movement of her chin, and his chest filled with something that he recognized at last as something other than grief, something that lived in the same deep chambers but moved in a different direction. He tucked the fiddle under his chin. He lifted the bow. He played. The first note was clear and true, and everything a note should be, and the room let out a collective breath that had been held for 3 years. He moved into the opening bars of a reel, something fast and bright and full of the kind of energy that gets into people's feet whether they want it there or not, and within 8 bars half the floor was moving, and within 16 bars the whole room was alive with it. He played for 2 hours. He played reels and waltzes and schottisches, and a slow air that made the older couples close their eyes and lean together, and a fast polka that resulted in Hattie Crane's husband losing his hat and not noticing for 3 full circles. He played Thomas's melody, the simple one, about halfway through the evening, and it was transformed from the broken thing it had been in June into something complete and lovely, a tune that would have made a 4-year-old clap his hands, and Evelyn heard it from across the room and pressed her hand briefly against her sternum, because her heart was too full to hold without some physical acknowledgement. Ira played looking at his strings and then looking at the room and then, frequently, looking at Evelyn, who danced when partners were offered and stood against the wall when they were not, but who never took her eyes entirely off him. When he finally lowered the bow for the last time and the dancing resolved into the scattered conversations of an evening ending well, the applause was the kind that involves actual feeling rather than mere courtesy. Several people clapped him on the shoulder. The mayor said something that Ira received with a nod. An elderly woman named Mrs. Flores, who had been in this valley since before Redemption Creek had a name, took his hand in both of hers and said, in Spanish-accented English, "The music missed you," and Ira looked at her and said, "I think I missed it too." He found Evelyn at the edge of the crowd, her wrap around her shoulders now that the evening had cooled, and he looked at her with everything the night had accumulated in him, and she looked back at him with the same abundance. "You were extraordinary," she said. "It came back," he said, and he was not only talking about the music. He walked her home in the dark, down the main street of Redemption Creek with the stars enormous overhead and the sound of the celebrating town still warm behind them. And they walked slowly because neither of them was in a hurry. And at the door of the general store, he stopped and turned toward her, and she turned toward him, and the lamplight from the window made the angles of his face warm and serious. "Evelyn," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and it sounded different from his mouth than names usually sounded, lower and more deliberate, as though he was saying something that would not easily be taken back. "Ira," she said. "I am 37 years old and I have not been a particularly cheerful man for some time," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," she said. "I am acquainted with who you are." "And I know who you are," he said. "I have been watching you work and talk and ride and think for 3 months, and I know who you are, and I would very much like to court you in the full and serious meaning of that word if you would have it." She looked at him with those brown eyes that were sharp and warm at the same time and said, "I would have it." He reached up and touched her face, just briefly, fingertips on her cheekbone, and then he stepped back and said good night, and she went inside, and she stood in the dark room with her hand against the cheek he had touched and laughed softly at herself for being so completely overtaken. The courtship of Ira Hudson and Evelyn Whitaker over the following months was, by Redemption Creek standards, conducted with appropriate propriety, and by the private understanding of the two people involved, with a depth that had very little to do with propriety and everything to do with the fact that they had both been alone in important ways for a long time, and had found in each other a particular kind of companionship that felt like coming home. He rode into town on more than Wednesdays now. She rode out to the ranch on Saturdays. They sat on his porch in the evenings, and she listened to him play, and he played things he had not played in years, music that had been waiting in the back of him for the conditions to be right. She told him about the ledger work, about the satisfaction of patterns in numbers, and he listened with actual interest, asking questions that showed he was thinking about what she said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. They disagreed sometimes about small things, and both of them said so directly, and both of them occasionally turned out to be wrong, and both of them were adult enough to say so. She told him about her mother, about the particular weight of growing up without one, about the things she had taught herself that mothers usually teach. He told her about Clara, not with bitterness but with honesty, about how the grief had been too big for two people to carry in the same house, but neither of them had known how to say so until too much time had passed, and the silence between them had become its own country with no road back. "I don't blame her," he said one evening, watching the sunset from the porch. "I just wasn't there, not really. I was somewhere else and she needed someone to be there." "Where were you?" Evelyn asked. "With Thomas," he said simply. "In whatever place it is you go when someone is gone and you can't leave them there alone." She reached over and took his hand without saying anything, and he turned it so their fingers were woven together, and they sat like that while the sky went through its evening colors. In August, Ira's ranch hand Cobb got into a dispute at the saloon with a drover from a passing cattle outfit, and the dispute escalated to a scuffle that involved a broken chair, and a split lip for Cobb, and what might have been worse if the bartender, a level-headed man named Tom Sayer, had not intervened with the authority that comes from being the largest person in a room. Ira went to retrieve Cobb from the marshal's temporary holding arrangement the following morning, and Evelyn, who had seen the whole thing from the store window, provided a calm and accurate account of events to the marshal that helped establish that Cobb had not initiated the fight, which resolved the matter in Cobb's favor. Ira thanked her afterward in the way he thanked people for things, directly and without elaboration. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "He works for you," she said. And it was the truth. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of profound feeling, the one that sat in his eyes rather than his face. "I am going to marry you," he said, and then he blinked as though he had surprised himself. She raised her eyebrows. "Is that a proposal or a prediction?" He took a breath and squared his shoulders and said, "Evelyn Whitaker, I am asking you to marry me. I am doing it badly and without any preparation, and I apologize for that, but I find I cannot not ask." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment with the morning sun on the street around them, and the sounds of Redemption Creek conducting its business, and the whole particular ordinary beauty of a Tuesday in August. "Yes," she said. The wedding was in September, in the Redemption Creek Church, on a Saturday morning when the Texas heat had just begun to soften toward autumn. Mrs. Aldridge cried openly and was unembarrassed about it. Jesse and Cobb stood in the back in their good clothes with their hats in their hands. The minister, a dry-humored man named Reverend Carlyle who had seen a great many weddings and was still moved by good ones, kept his remarks brief and his reading careful. The church was full because the whole town had wanted to be there, and not out of mere curiosity but out of something genuine, a collective sense that this was a thing worth witnessing. Evelyn wore the best dress she had, the one she had made room for in her traveling bag, even when every inch of space was precious, a deep blue wool with ivory trim at the collar and cuffs. She had washed her auburn hair and let Mrs. Aldridge pin it up properly, and there were 2 small white flowers from the Aldridge garden tucked above her ear. She was not a woman who placed great store in appearances, but she had looked in the mirror that morning with the sense that she was equal to this moment, which was a different thing from vanity. Ira had borrowed a suit coat from the hotel proprietor, who was close to his size, and he had brushed his hat and his boots, and he stood at the front of the church with the particular stillness that was simply who he was. And when she came down the aisle on Mrs. Aldridge's arm, he looked at her with dark eyes full of everything he had become capable of feeling again, and she saw it all and walked toward it without hesitation. When Reverend Carlyle asked if anyone present had reason to object, there was a beat of silence, and then "Old Mrs." Flores called out from the 3rd row, "No objections, do continue," which made the room laugh, and even Ira's face broke into a real smile, the kind that changed his whole face, and Evelyn squeezed his hand and laughed too. After the ceremony there was a dinner on the church lawn and then, naturally, music. Ira played for 2 hours at his own wedding reception, which everyone agreed was the kind of thing you remembered for a long time, and the music was different now from what it had been even in July. Fuller somehow, less like recovery and more like arrival. He played the familiar reels and a waltz that he and Evelyn had danced to in the town hall in July. And when he played Thomas's melody again, Evelyn was standing beside him holding her own cup of apple cider, and she put her hand on his arm while he played, and he did not miss a note. And perhaps that was the moment everyone understood that what had happened here was not merely 2 people getting married, but a man coming all the way back from somewhere very far away. They settled into life at the ranch, with the practical ease of 2 people who were both genuinely suited to it. Evelyn did not give up her bookkeeping work. She expanded it, riding out to 3 ranches in the valley and keeping Mrs. Aldridge's accounts from her new home with a system of correspondence that Mrs. Aldridge found perfectly satisfactory. She transformed the ranch house, not dramatically but perceptibly, into a place that felt inhabited rather than merely occupied. She put a cloth on the table and a plant on the windowsill, and moved the furniture a quarter turn so the morning light fell across the room rather than against the wall. Ira watched these changes with the expression of a man who is surprised to find he likes something he did not know he needed. The fiddle remained on its bracket on the wall, but now it was often in use, and its dust was gone, and on evenings when the work was done and the cedar hills went gold in the late light, you might hear it from the porch if you were passing along the road below, clear and warm through the autumn air. They talked about Thomas openly now, which Ira had not been able to do with anyone before. He told her stories about the boy, small detailed ones, the kind that are the real inheritance of a person. How Thomas had named all the chickens, including the rooster, with great seriousness and revised the names weekly. How he had been convinced that the creek had a turtle who was specifically his friend and checked for this turtle every single day. How he had asked once, with 4-year-old sincerity, whether the stars were holes in something or lights on something, and Ira had told him honestly that he did not know, and Thomas had considered this and said, "I think they are lights, because holes would let the cold in," which had struck Ira as both philosophically sound and climatologically reasonable. Evelyn listened to all of it and stored it carefully, the way you store things that matter. She thought about children. They had not discussed it directly, and she was not sure of the terrain, given what he had lost, but she thought about it in the quiet of the ranch, listening to the night sounds and the steady breathing beside her. She told him, one November evening by the fire, that she would like to have children if he was willing, and she said it plainly because plainness was how they spoke to each other, and she said she understood if that was a complicated subject and there was no pressure. He was quiet for a long while, looking at the fire. "Thomas would have liked you," he said finally. "He would have followed you everywhere." She felt the tears come and let them, because this was the kind of moment when pretending you don't feel something would be dishonest. "I would have liked him too," she said. Ira looked at her with those dark eyes. "Yes," he said, "I would like that very much. A family." He said the word family as though he was testing whether it still fit in his mouth, whether he was allowed to want it again. She took his hand and held it. "Then we will make one," she said. Winter came on gently that year, as Texas hill country winters do, cold at night and mild by day, with occasional hard frosts that made the cedar berries bright blue, and the creek run quietly under sheets of thin ice at the edges. The ranch was quiet with the particular quiet of winter work. Fence repair, hay management, the maintenance of things so that spring would find them sound. Cobb and Jesse kept the cattle counted and tended, and Ira split wood in the mornings with the focused energy of a man who is at peace with his life and expresses it through physical work. Evelyn organized their finances with the thoroughness she applied to everything, and by the end of November she had a clear picture of the ranch's economics that showed them comfortable without being wealthy, and with room to improve if the cattle prices held through next fall. She shared this with Ira over the kitchen table one evening with the ledger open between them, and he listened and asked good questions, and then he said, "You are the most organized person I have ever encountered," and she said, "Disorder makes me anxious," and he said, "I know, I've watched you straighten the account books 3 times after I've touched them," which made her laugh and admit it was true. Christmas was a quiet celebration, just the two of them at the ranch plus Cobb and Jesse for supper, with a goose that Evelyn had been preparing for since November and 2 pies and a quantity of cornbread. She had found a small spruce branch and decorated it with paper stars and set it in the window, which Ira had looked at with a complicated expression for a moment before he said it was fine. It was good. That evening, he played the fiddle for a long time by the fire, working through carols and hymns and several reels that had nothing to do with Christmas but everything to do with joy. And Evelyn sat in the rocking chair she had acquired in October and listened, watching his face while he played, watching the way the firelight moved over him, watching the bow move across the strings with the confidence that had been rebuilding itself since June like a structure carefully constructed to last. She thought about how different he was from the man she had first seen in the store in April, still and elsewhere, a man attending to the business of the world from behind something thick. And she thought about how different she was from the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with her worn-down boot heels and her careful letter and her last savings, holding herself together by will alone. They had both arrived at this evening by routes that included considerable loss, and she found, sitting in the firelight listening to her husband play, that she was not sad about the loss but grateful that the route had brought them here. In February, she confirmed what she had suspected since January. She told him on a Sunday morning, standing in the kitchen while the coffee came up on the stove, and she said it directly, the way she said things. "I am expecting a child. Sometime in September, I think." He was at the table and he went very still. She watched him carefully because this was important and she wanted to see him clearly. His face went through several things in quick succession that she could read because she knew him now. The first flash of something sharp and frightened, the grief memory trying to assert itself, the practiced reflex of guarding against love because love had proven it could be taken, and then, winning over all of it, a slow and absolute light coming into his dark eyes that was the best thing she had ever seen on a human face. He stood up and came to her and took her face in both hands and looked at her, and his eyes were bright with it, that undisguised light. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. He pressed his forehead against hers and closed his eyes and said something very quiet that she was not sure was addressed to her or to Thomas or to whatever larger presence he communed with in private moments, and she put her hands over his and held them there. Spring came back to the valley with its absolute annual confidence, the bluebonnets coming up in sheets along the roadsides, the creek full and singing, the cattle fat on green grass. Evelyn continued her work through the spring, slowing slightly by May but not stopping, because she was practical and capable, and a pregnancy was not, in her considered opinion, an illness. She rode more carefully, and she let Ira take over certain tasks around the ranch that involved heavy lifting, which he did without being asked, and without making it into a thing. They were visited in April by Ira's older sister Margaret, who came from Fredericksburg, where she lived with her husband and 3 children. Margaret was a direct, warm woman who had the same dark eyes as Ira, and who embraced Evelyn at the door with the unguarded affection of someone who had been hoping for this for years. She stayed 4 days, and in that time she and Evelyn established the particular rapid, deep friendship that sometimes forms between women who recognize in each other a similar type of mind. Margaret told Evelyn on the 3rd evening while Ira was outside with her husband looking at the cattle that the family had given up hope of Ira being happy again, that they had watched him from a distance for 3 years and had not known how to reach him, and that what she saw now was the most complete return she had ever witnessed in a person. "You did not fix him," Margaret said carefully, because she was choosing her words. "I want to be clear about that. He did the work. But you gave him a reason to do it." Evelyn considered this. "I asked him to play the fiddle," she said. Margaret looked at her steadily. "Yes," she said, "you did, and you knew what you were asking." Evelyn did not deny it. The summer was full and busy, and exactly what a summer on a working ranch should be. The cattle drive to the San Antonio railhead went well, with Ira and Cobb and Jesse moving the herd south in late June and returning in early July with the season's proceeds secured, which Evelyn had already half allocated in her ledger before he got back. She had maintained the ranch in his absence with the focused competence of a woman who had spent years managing a boarding house and understood perfectly well that the difference between a hotel and a ranch was mostly a matter of the guests having 4 legs. When he rode back into the yard on a Saturday afternoon, dusty and tired from the trail, she was on the porch, larger now with the summer months, and she came to the steps and he got down from his horse and came to her, and they held each other for a long moment in the warm July afternoon. "Everything all right?" he said against her hair. "Everything is fine," she said. The south pasture fence held. Mrs. Flores sent 2 jars of her peach preserves over, and I am saving them for when the baby is here. Your sister wrote and wants to know the moment anything happens." He laughed, low and full. "Of course she does." And I finished the Henderson account, which has been a puzzle for 3 months, and the answer was that he has been multiplying instead of adding in the livestock column, which explains everything. He pulled back enough to look at her face. "I missed you enormously," he said. "I missed you too," she said. "Go wash up. Supper is almost ready." The last days of September arrived with the reliable indifference of time, and on a Sunday morning, with the Cedar Hills turning the faintest gold in the air, carrying the first real bite of autumn, Evelyn Hudson, formerly Whitaker, gave birth to a son. The labor was attended by Mrs. Aldridge, who had assisted at a dozen deliveries in her decades in the valley, and by the valley's doctor, a competent young man named Dr. Paris, who had come to Redemption Creek 2 years prior from a medical school in St. Louis, and who inspired confidence by being calm and saying only what needed to be said. Ira was in the house, not in the room, which was the custom and also probably necessary because he would have been useless in there, but in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cold cup of coffee, conducting the internal negotiation that a man conducts when the person he loves most is doing something dangerous that he has no power to help with. The baby arrived at mid-morning and announced himself with the thorough and indignant cry of someone who had been perfectly comfortable where he was and had opinions about the current situation. When Mrs. Aldridge opened the kitchen door and told Ira he could come in, he found Evelyn in the bed with a small bundle in her arms, tired and brilliant-eyed and looking at him with the full direct warmth of her brown gaze. And the small bundle was a son, red-faced and scrunched and entirely himself. And Ira looked at him for a long moment before he reached out and took the weight of him into his own arms. He stood there with his son, and his face was something beyond expression, something too large for any word, and Evelyn watched him and let it be as large as it needed to be. "Hello," Ira said to the baby, very quietly, as though the word was enough. They named him James Thomas Hudson. James for Ira's father, Thomas for the boy who had come before him, whose mystery drawer and ceiling-watching turtle would live on now in the stories told to this new son, who would know about his brother the same way Evelyn had known about her father's harmonica. As a treasure, as a tenderness, as part of the texture of a family that carried its past forward with love rather than weight. Mrs. Aldridge stayed for 3 days to help, which was more useful than Ira's enthusiastic but slightly panicked attempts to manage everything at once. He had read one book on infant care that Margaret had sent over in August, and he had annotated it heavily in the margins, and he consulted it with the same focused seriousness he brought to account books, which made Evelyn love him more than she had thought she could. James Thomas Hudson, called James or occasionally Jamie by his father when the man was in a particularly warm mood, which was increasingly the default, was a substantial and opinionated infant who slept well when he chose to and vigorously protested everything else. He had Ira's dark eyes and Evelyn's determined chin, and he was, in the entirely biased assessment of both his parents, the most interesting person ever born. The ranch had a new rhythm now, organized around feeding schedules and nap windows and the particular vigilance of new parenthood, and Ira moved through it with an adaptation that surprised Evelyn in its thoroughness. He was not a man who did anything halfway, and this included fatherhood. He was up at first cry, and he walked laps of the kitchen in the pre-dawn quiet with the baby against his chest. And Evelyn, watching from the doorway with her eyes half open, found these scenes so tender and complete that she had to press her hand to her mouth to contain what they did to her. One evening in late October, when James was 4 weeks old and finally beginning to understand that the world was not actively hostile to him, Ira sat in the rocking chair by the fire with the baby in the crook of his arm and the fiddle beside him, and he looked at the fiddle and then at his son. And then, with the particular problem-solving ingenuity of a man who plays fiddle and has a sleeping infant. He managed to shift the baby to a position where one arm was free. And he picked up the fiddle and rested it on the chair arm in a position that was absolutely not the proper way to hold a violin and would have made any serious musician wince. And he played softly, barely above a whisper in terms of volume, just enough to make the sound. He played Thomas's melody. James opened his dark eyes and looked up at the firelight with the complete unfocused attention of an infant who is processing every sensation as a novel event, and his small fist uncurled slightly, as though the music had reached him in whatever warm place babies inhabit before they fully arrive in the world. Evelyn stood in the doorway and did not say anything. She watched the fire and the rocking chair and the man and the baby and the fiddle, and she let herself feel the full weight and width of what her life had become, the arrival of it, the rightness of it, the particular grace of ordinary things arranged just so. It occurred to her, standing there, that she had come to Redemption Creek with a canvas bag and a satchel and the last of her savings and no certainty of anything, and she had found a job that suited her and a town that had room for her and a man who had been living in the aftermath of the worst thing he had ever experienced, and she had asked him to play the fiddle, and neither of them had expected what happened next, which was this, all of it, the coffee in the tin cups, the 4th of July dancing, the ceremony in the church and the music that followed, the December fire and the Christmas spruce branch, the February morning with the light in his dark eyes. And now the October firelight and the baby and the melody, Thomas's melody, carrying forward. She went to the chair and sat on the arm of it, and Ira shifted to make room without stopping playing, and James looked at both of them with the dark, serious eyes that were his father's eyes. And Evelyn put her arm around Ira's shoulders and he leaned slightly into it. And the melody continued, small and warm and real, into the night. As winter settled over the hill country, and the cedar hills went dark and the creek ran cold, and the stars came out enormous over the ranch in the clear Texas nights, the family found the shape of itself with the quiet satisfaction of things that have come to rest in the right configuration. Ira played more freely now, not only in the evenings but sometimes in the mornings, a few bars of something while the coffee was coming up, a reel when the work was light and the day was good. The music had come all the way back, not to what it had been before, because before was before, but to something different and equally whole, music that had been through grief and come out the other side and knew things about itself that it had not known before. He played at the Christmas social, which he had not done since before Thomas died, and the town of Redemption Creek received it with the warmth of people who have been waiting for something good, and are not surprised when it finally arrives, only grateful. He played the old reels and the familiar waltzes and several new pieces he had worked out over the autumn, and the dancing went long into the evening, and James slept through most of it in Mrs. Aldridge's arms, because Mrs. Aldridge had claimed him the moment they arrived and shown no intention of giving him back. The year turned to 1886 with a January thaw and then a cold snap that drove everyone inside for a week, and the ranch house was warm and lamplit, and full of the sounds of a household that has people in it who belong there. Evelyn returned to her full bookkeeping work in February, managing the accounts of 4 ranches and the general store from the ranch house desk, with the baby in a basket beside her, which was not the most professionally conventional arrangement but was effective. James regarded the account books with interest and occasionally contributed opinions that, while illegible, were offered with conviction. Spring brought Margaret and her family for a week's visit, 3 children who ran through the ranch yard in the specific chaos of children who know they are welcome and have been given no reason to be careful. Ira watched them with the particular expression she had come to know as his happy expression, the one that did not broadcast itself too loudly, but lived in the ease of his posture and the set of his eyes. Margaret held James for approximately the entire visit and announced that he was a superior specimen of humanity, which Evelyn accepted without argument. On the last evening of Margaret's visit, there was an informal gathering on the porch, the adults in chairs and on the steps, the older children chasing fireflies in the yard, the baby asleep in his basket, and Ira played the fiddle while the warm spring dark settled over the cedar hills. The music went out into the evening air and moved through the grass and the cedar scent and the firefly light, and it was, in that moment, exactly what music is for. In the months that followed, the rhythms of the ranch and the family settled into the kind of depth that does not come quickly, that has to be built through the accumulation of ordinary days. Mornings with coffee and the particular quality of early light across the hill country, evenings on the porch with the fiddle or without it, seasons of work that left the body tired in a way that felt good, seasons of quiet that felt like rest rather than emptiness. They argued sometimes because they were both people with opinions, and they made up without the arguments becoming walls, because they had both learned enough about walls to know they were not worth building. They laughed often, at small things, at the ridiculous persistence of the south pasture fence that seemed to require repair regardless of what was done to it, at the political opinions of the chickens regarding the placement of the feed, at James's increasingly determined attempts to achieve locomotion. In the summer of 1887, Evelyn told Ira over the breakfast table that they were expecting again. He looked at her across the table with his coffee cup in his hand and the morning light coming through the window, and this time there was no first flash of fear, only the clear, uncomplicated light in his dark eyes, and he said, "Good," and meant the whole large word of it. Their second child arrived in February of 1888 and was a daughter, born in the same manner as her brother, but with what Dr. Paris called rather more theatrical commentary during the process, which was consistent with her subsequent disposition. They named her Clara Rose Hudson, Clara for a name that had history in Ira's life, but that they chose to carry forward with new meaning rather than leave behind, and Rose for no particular reason except that Evelyn had always liked the word. James Hudson, aged 2 years and 4 months, regarded his sister with the philosophical equanimity of a person who has not yet understood the full implications of the situation. And then, within a week, with the absolute and total devotion that would characterize their relationship for the rest of their lives. Clara Rose Hudson turned out to be a child who would not be quiet for long, who had opinions from very early about the arrangement of the world, and who discovered at age 2 that her father's fiddle was on a shelf she could just barely reach if she stood on her toes, an achievement she was enormously proud of, and her parents were swiftly terrified by. Ira moved the fiddle to a higher bracket, which Clara regarded as an injustice she would not soon forgive. She did eventually learn to play it, years later, taught by her father with the same patient attention he brought to everything, and James learned too, not with the same fire as his sister, but with a steadiness that was entirely his own character. But that was later, after many other ordinary, extraordinary days. For now, in the February of 1888, with the Cedar Hills gray-white under a winter sky, and the ranch house warm with fire and lamp, and the breathing of small sleeping children, Ira Hudson sat at the table across from his wife while the house was quiet, and he looked at her in the way he had developed over these 3 years of marriage, with the full, unhurried attention of a man who knows exactly what he has and does not take it for granted. "Are you happy?" she asked him once. Not this evening, but another one, sometime in that winter, when the question arose naturally from a moment of such ordinary completeness that it seemed worth asking aloud. He thought about it in the way he thought about things that mattered with the serious consideration they deserved. "I did not think I would be happy again," he said. "After Thomas, I thought that was a part of me that had closed, and I think I had decided to accept that. And now," she said, "now," he said, "I understand that the closed part was waiting. It needed the right conditions." He looked at her across the fire. "It needed you and the fiddle." She smiled at that. "In that order." "In that order," he confirmed, and reached across the table and took her hand. Outside, the cedar hills held their darkness under the winter stars, and the creek ran quiet below the ranch, and the Texas sky was as wide as it had ever been, full of the particular clarity that comes after cold and before morning, with the stars either holes or lights depending on who you asked. And inside the ranch house the fire was warm, and the fiddle was on its higher bracket, and two children breathed in their sleep, and two people sat across a table and held hands, and there was nothing unresolved, nothing owed, nothing outstanding. There was only this, the accumulated weight of ordinary days made into something that lasted. Ira Hudson had not played the fiddle since his son died. Evelyn Whitaker had asked him to. Neither of them had expected what happened next. They had both expected far less and been given far more and knew it, and were grateful for it every single day. The music never stopped again.